Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I'm here with the fabulous, the unbelievable Tommy Orange, who has just put out his sophomore book 6 years after the much celebrated There There. The book is called Wandering Stars, and we're going to get to Tommy in a second. But first, welcome as always to The Thoughtful Bro. We're here live on Tuesdays at 2, today Wednesday, for What Makes Great Books Tick, What Makes Great Authors Tick. We're part of A Mighty Blaze. As everybody knows, A Mighty Blaze is the all-volunteer initiative that started during COVID to help authors who had canceled book tours, help them reach readers virtually. And now, 4 years later, we're still going strong. We are never asking for your money on Thoughtful Bro or on A Mighty Blaze. Everything is free. If you want to show the love, just like us or follow us or tell your friends about us. But if you are in the mood to spend some money today, here's what I recommend. I would recommend that you spend it on books that probe Native identity, assimilation, and history, books that are yearning and elegiac, filled with sorrow and haunting imagery, books that are critical to the national conversations that both Natives and Americans are having about how to reckon with memory and the truth about this country's past. Books like Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. Just go ahead right now, open up a new browser tab, and order a few copies of Wandering Stars for yourself and your friends. We will put links to buy it on bookshop.org in the chat. And if you have questions for Tommy, we're going to go about 45, 50 minutes. We'll get to the questions at the end. Just pop them in the chat and they'll make their way to us. Tommy Orange is a graduate of the MFA program at the Institute of the American Indian Arts. He is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland. His first book, There There, was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and received the 2019 American Book Award. He now lives in Oakland, where he was born. His latest book, Wandering Stars, explores the legacies of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School through 3 generations of family. It's a modern epic of warriors and drunks, intergenerational trauma and identity, a story of outlaws and addicts. And I think Kwame Adjei-Brenyah said it best when he said, Tommy Orange is one of our most important writers. Tommy Orange, I'm so happy to have you here. I know you are busy. Welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
100%. So, just finished the book this morning. It was incredible. Your books just aren't really like any other books out there, as far as I see it. The New Yorker comped it to Dennis Johnson, which I thought was great and appropriate. Other books that came to mind for me are If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. Jonathan gave you a great review in the New York Times. I mean, he is probing in that book questions around kind of what am I and kind of being in between ethnicities and cultures. Another comp is obviously from your good friend Kaveh Akbar. I think Martyr takes on a lot of these same questions around addiction and identity. But the one that I haven't seen, the comp that I haven't seen that I really felt was Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. About the cruelty to students at the Dozier School in Florida in the Jim Crow South. But I'm just wondering for you, like, are those comps making sense to you? How do you see your book kind of on the shelf and amid these other books?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've heard some people say they don't like to read books while they're writing their book, and I think that's insane. So my book is definitely in conversation with a lot of different books, and the ones you named, completely accurate. I was so happy to get that review from Jonathan because I loved his book, and to get praise like that in the New York Times from an author that you love um, is an incredible feeling. So I was really grateful for that one, and I read Jonathan's book while I was writing Wandering Stars, and obviously the Kaveh Akbar, we wrote the books together, so that's an easy one. But Dennis Johnson was an early influence, and the review saying doing what I was doing as good as Dennis Johnson, I feel like is pretty high praise because he's sort of considered the master of the form. And the one that you said was not in conversation, and I'm surprised too that I haven't heard it referenced that much. Nickel Boys was one that I read that was formative in thinking about how to write this book. For sure, the tone and the pacing, and I guess also like the the way into such like a brutal sort of environment, not having to have it be, you know, the focus be brutality while having the brutality be there, which is tricky. Um, and I feel like he handled it beautifully in Nickel Boys. So I do feel like all of the books that you named are in conversation, and there's probably like a dozen more that would go in the same category.
And for those who might not know about this like quite unique and quite creatively productive friendship that you have with Kaveh Akbar, you have the same editor, and as you said, you wrote these books together. But I think it's quite unique and uncommon what really went down. Can you just take a moment and describe that?
Yeah, so I was already a fan of his before I went to Purdue for an event. I think getting to the event was, um, I think it happened because of my friend Therese Mayad, who wrote a book called Heartberries. We both graduated from the Institute of American Indian Arts in 2016, and essentially finished our books together. We, our theses we wrote in the program, and we sort of were racing to finish because you only can write half a book in that program. It's a 2-year program. It's meant to be kind of accelerated, and I think other MFAs you can write like a whole book as your thesis, and this was not the case, and we didn't want to lose momentum. So me and Therese raced to finish our books together. So I'd already had that experience, and we sold our books within 2 weeks of each other, and our books came out within months of each other. So that was already a crazy thing that happened. And then in 2019, I went to Purdue, um, and Therese was teaching there at the time, and so Kaveh came out to a dinner that they had for me before or after the event. Um, and so, like I said, I was a fan of his. We, after the dinner thing, we go to another social thing, and I drive with him, um, and his wife, and we're talking about he's the success of They're There, and so I find out that he's a fan, and he asks me like, "What's the craziest thing that's happened to you because of the success of They're There?" And I was like, "Well, I got to do a Simpsons table read," and he goes, "Fuck you," and he's like so mad at me for it, but because he loves The Simpsons so much. And that was the kind of the beginning of what we realized would be a lot of shared love for literature, for pop culture, music, a deep love of music. Um, and so we just started trading pages soon after that, and it turned into like directly working on the novels we were working on together.
And so, last thing before we move on from this, but just tell me one thing about this book that would not be if not for that relationship.
I think facing addiction in myself and having it be an addiction centered book all happened because of Kaveh. Um, I come from a family of addicts, and it's been a part of my life for years. So it's not like I was in some kind of denial, but the way that I've been able to write about it and face it in myself came from my relationship with him and friendship with him.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the title of the book. And I have to just give a shout out because I, this book, among the many other great things it did for me, it sent me back to one of the great albums of the 1990s, Dummy by Portishead. I mean, that there was a 2-year period where that was almost all that I listened to. And I've always, Wandering Stars on that album has always been my favorite song on that album as well. And, you get into the lyrics of that song. I didn't know that it was from the Bible, this refrain about wandering stars in the blackness and the darkness. But it's quite a poetic title. And I know there's some story behind that title as well.
Yeah, actually, I realized recently, um, because I thought of doing the sequel and that the sequel would be named Wandering Stars in a single moment when I heard the song come on a Spotify playlist that was based on There There that some sales reps put on at a warehouse for Penguin Random House when I was doing a signing for There There in 2018 before There There even came out. But I realized I knew Portishead and I knew that album because and I lived through that era, but I can't say that I was like at the time a huge Portishead fan or even knew about them So there was this guy named Kid Beyond, and I don't remember when I first saw him. I think he's probably still performing. He's a beatboxer, and his like main thing that he would do as part of all of his sets was a version of Wandering Star by
Nice.
Portishead, all himself with a looping pedal.
Oh,
And
dude.
I think I really went at Portishead hard after that, and I only probably heard him in like 2001, 2, 3, around that time after Portishead had already been a huge thing. Um, and so I only realized recently that my entrance into Portishead was through this beatboxer in Oakland. Um, anyway, so I thought of the that I was going to do it in that single moment, um, not knowing then that it was going to lead me to the Bible and to this history in 1875 that would then lead me to the origin of the boarding schools and writing this big historical chunk at the beginning of the novel.
Yeah. Um, so, Tommy, I think it's safe to say one of the things that you are most known for, certainly this is what There There did, and then you continue doing this in this work, is this just the question of Native American identity today, and just sort of the idea of these characters thinking, I want to embrace my history or I want to be Native or Indian, but I don't know how to do it. And it's just so complicated in so many ways. And clearly, it's such a kind of nuanced and huge topic that you've filled 2 books unpacking this question of Native identity. And I guess just to put this into a question, I mean, first you can let me know if you feel like that's a fair characterization, but also, your first book came out 6 years ago. I'm just wondering, kind of where are we at in this conversation around Native identity, and like, has it even changed in the last 6 years? Certainly, looking at Lily Gladstone and the Oscars, Reservation Dogs, the most recent season of True Detective. There does seem to be something of a moment in our culture, putting natives to the forefront more than before. But I'm just wondering, are you seeing kind of a movement here? And if so, like, how would you characterize it? And movement, I don't mean like a movement, like a political movement. I mean like kind of movement in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be hard to deny that it's a moment. There is movement. Um, that's definitely true. I think there's so much noise right now. Like, I feel like when There came out, um, we were all able to focus our attention more collectively on individual things, and it just feels like there are so many things out there right now. And after the pandemic, like everybody got rattled in a way that they're just sort of like hanging on for dear life in a way, but not really admitting that we are. It's just like everything's fine. Let's not talk about it. Everything's fine. Um, and so I think the conversation is both moving forward and stuck.
Mm,
Um, we're working against hundreds of years of a narrative about natives being gone, or natives only being actual natives if we look this certain static way. You only hear the Pilgrim story for how many, you know, generations of American lives and American narrative where all you're hearing is how we relate to the Pilgrims 400 years ago. There's a lot to work against to be like, no, actually, we have office jobs, and we, you know, we have nuances about tastes in trucks in rural areas, and like all these modern things, like we prefer Pepsi to Coke. Like we have the slew of modern things that have not been explored or acknowledged. And um, I think we just have a long ways to go. I was really hoping that Killers of the Flower Moon would sweep. Um, Not because I'm like a huge fan of the movie. I'm not a huge fan. But the visibility piece, and
mm,
that always being a good thing for us and opening doors for a lot of people. And I, of course, wanted Lily Gladstone to win. Um, and I think it was really sad to have it be completely like no
yeah.
wins. I think, given that it's an election year and the person that we're thinking about, half of us are thinking about putting into office, this is the part that's like completely stuck in this idea that America was once this one thing that it never was. That conversation is stuck because you're trying to look at something that was never there and then somehow project that into the future. Like
Yeah.
that's a fucked up thing to try to project this thing that never was, that
Yeah.
that people are pretending once was. Um, and Native people are very used to that American narrative. Um, so I do have hope because there's a lot of books coming out and there's a lot of media to come that can continue to change the idea of us, and expand the conversation. So I don't want to sound like bitter or like um, like I don't believe in what's happening right now, but I also don't want to be naive because um, I think that how many representations have you seen of us in cities,
Mm.
like depicted in cities, and yet 80% of us have been living there for more than a decade. 80% of us. So that's a decade of, there's 5 million of us, right? 80% of 5 million. So at 400,000, that's not the right math. It's 4 million. It's closer to 4 million, I think. 35 million, 3.5 million. I think that's the right math. Um,
I'm not the guy to ask.
and so like over a decade of that many of us living in cities, how many stories is that, right?
Yeah.
And how many stories are we not hearing about our relationship to modernity and to cities and city life? We know that cities teem with life and stories, and so I think there's a resistance, people not wanting to take on projects that depict us in these ways because they're like, I don't think people are going to connect with that. And look at something like Killers of the Flower Moon, hugely popular, us still being depicted historically. People that make these decisions to take on these projects, they still want us in these familiar settings. So there's a lot of resistance to change the narrative.
And Tommy, let me just unpack one thing that you said in there. You said when there's a moment like this, and I've heard you talk about how there was another moment, like when Dances with Wolves, of all things, happened. There was another moment that is similar, where Native stories and culture is coming to the forefront. You said that opens a lot of doors. Just unpack that for me a little bit. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like to have Native culture put to the forefront to open doors for the broader Native community?
Well, I think it's an industry thing. Like we work in industries, right? Publishing industry, film industry, TV industry. If something has success, then people will take risks on things that they wouldn't have taken risks on before because that something had success. So it's just like with like a big cast of actors in Reservation Dogs. Um, you know, somebody will take a chance on a show because they've seen that this kind of show can be popular, and now there's a pool of actors to pick from. So, like our success can build on itself, and so there's a bunch of different ways that it works. But the industry piece and the fact that we do work in an industry, and for a lot of our art to be able to be backed and sort of promoted into visibility requires money and the forces that be to be
Yeah.
behind it.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about what really is central to a lot of your work, in my view, which is the struggle between memory and forgetting. And it happens in the individual characters, and I think it's also happening on a broader cultural scale. It's happening to the characters because it's extraordinarily painful to remember, and it's extraordinarily difficult to accurately remember. But there's also a need to remember, to honor the past, and to truly understand where one comes from. But I think in a broader sense, there is a struggle in this country between memory and forgetting. And if you look at something like the 1619 Project, there is something that seems uncontroversial on its face, at least to me, which is, let's just kind of really talk about 400 years after the first slaves came here. Let's talk about what really went down. But then there is an entire movement trying to ban these facts from schools and from the broader discourse. And there's an essay, I'm about to sound a little bit academic, but just bear with me for a moment. There's a famous essay by a French historian called Ernest Renan called What is a Nation? And I just want to read for you a passage from it and get your reaction. So this is an often quoted passage from this essay. He says, forgetfulness, and I would even say historical error, are essential in the creation of a nation. Unity is always achieved by brutality, And the joining of the north of France with the south of France involved nearly a century of extermination and terror. Yet the essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common. So today, no French person knows whether he was originally Burgundian or Visigoth, but every French citizen has forgotten the massacre that took place 800 years ago. And so this struggle between memory and forgetting and the forging of unity within a nation is what he's discussing there. And I just kind of see that everywhere in your work.
Absolutely. And I think we have an opportunity to see in a more clear-eyed way. And I think 800 years sounds crazy because we're a really young nation, and some of us are trying to steer this thing to look back in a more clear-eyed way. And I understand the logic of like we need to have a sort of heroic or I don't know, noble history to think of to make good citizens who then want to carry on as, patriots who will be obedient servants to the to the nation. Like I do get the logic, but I think where we're at in history, and even as a global sort of consciousness, in all the information that we have, is just kind of an unprecedented time. I think we have the ability to do something unprecedented, and I think there can be a unity in looking at what the foundation of this country is and moving on together. Nobody's asking things to be reversed. I think just the acknowledgement of like, let's not go on with the fairy tale, like, because that brings so much harm to so many people, and not only Native people. To go on as if this thing were true when it wasn't is not good for anybody. It's corrosive to the American soul to just happily march on with this pilgrim story. But obviously it's a very strong story, and I think with the slavery piece, there's a convenient way to turn that into a hero story. Like we have the white savior in Abe Lincoln who freed the slaves, and that you can like use as a structure to build the still noble. That was our original sin, and we moved on from it, and that's how we're stronger together. And I think that's worked, but that hasn't happened for this other original sin, the twin sin of the taking of the land and the killing of the people who were indigenous to the land. We don't have a convenient hero story to tie that in or tie that up nicely, to work it in, to have that. It's just sort of like needs to be buried, and that's the way we've responded as a country, as if like there is no way to save that story. Let's just bury it. So yeah, in the work, in there, I delve into history like a little bit in the prologue and the interlude, but mostly it's about contemporary Native lives, and I very much look hard back at a couple parts of history in Wandering Stars, and partly because of what you're describing, to not have to be a forgetful, amnesiac country who needs to forget in order to move on with unity. I think there is a way forward without having to just forget or bury.
Wholly agree. Wholly agree. Tom, I want to talk about sadness in the book. My heart hurt for a lot of this book. You certainly, you have many gifts as a writer, but certainly, representing sorrow, and this kind of like universe-sized, crushing tragedy that some of these characters feel and internalize. That is something that you do with great poetry. I've heard you talk about Confederacy of Dunces as an influence, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath as an influence, kind of these books that kind of showed you what novels can do. And certainly those books have a lot of personal tragedy in them. But I guess the question I have for you is just, why is the novel a great medium for unpacking the emotional freight that you want to unpack in your work?
Yeah, I didn't think of why Sylvia Plath and John Kennedy Toole were like so impactful for me until much later. I'm like, oh, they both killed themselves. Why why was I so into people that killed themselves? Uh, I think, my life has been filled with sadness. That's something that I am very aware of and try to write through. I think novels can just do a lot to create atmosphere and nuance and complexity. And I think sadness is one of those things that does not get a lot of times doesn't get complexity or nuance. It's something that we kind of look away from. Like sadness is just sad. Like, let's not talk about it. Don't make me sad. People kind of have this attitude, like, uh, I think more people are sad than want to admit that they're sad. And I think part of why we can't talk about it more is because we don't have complex conversations about it. Like, life can be super sad and filled with joy at once, but people, especially like the American way is sort of like put up a happy front and we're all trying to live our best life or whatever. Like, I think it's harmful to the health of our emotional intelligence to not be able to include like uh, I fucking hate this aspect of life. It makes me super sad all the time. Like, we can't have that be a part of conversations. It sort of has to be like putting on the happy face, and social media very much reflects like um, this putting on your best face and your best life, and I think that's super corrosive too.
Mm-hmm.
So then, that's, I don't know if I answered your question exactly.
You
The
did.
novel, it brings the complexity in ways that I think music does it too. Music can like carry without any explanation happiness and sadness at once in ways that are very transforming. But that's more mysterious.
And just one further question on this, just about storytelling. There's an incredible line in the book: just because the bad thing stops happening to you doesn't mean it stops happening to you. And just the way that, trauma just resurfaces and resurfaces. And often for many people, trauma can resurface for one's entire life. And a lot of what you're talking about here is the trauma that, in some cases just is in the past and generations ago, still resurfacing, still resurfacing. Can you just talk for a moment? You just talked about music and its ability to do complex things and express sadness. But is the act of storytelling, in your view, a way to actually come to terms with trauma, alleviate trauma? I'm almost talking about story as therapeutic at this point.
Yeah, I think there's um, a line that you walk because I think as a writer, writing is not simply therapeutic. It's like it fucks with you and it's really hard. And I mean, I guess therapy does that too, but I think I think it's more than therapy. I think it's bigger than therapy. I think there can be therapeutic aspects. For me, I think finding ways to express things that you that were inside you that you couldn't clarify without writing is super
Mm.
helpful. Like, sometimes I get the question like, how do you take care of yourself after you write about heavy stuff? And it's like, actually writing about the heavy stuff and explaining it better, like pulling it out and revising it and clarifying it so that I can see it for what it is the helpful thing that I'm doing. It's not heavier because I'm bringing it out and 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 trying my best to express it. It's actually alleviating a lot of weight.
I've heard you talk about this book and how hard it was for you to write this book. Now, obviously, there's some kind of the first book had a lot of success, and there's like a little bit of added pressure there and an audience waiting for you. But I think it was more than that when you talked about having some regret and just some real just difficulty coming to the end and finishing this book. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, I mean the second book, um, It's very hard. Every author that I've talked to has said the same thing. I think to the point that if it wasn't hard for an author, they're even pretending that it was, so that they don't sound like a freak, or like because I've just heard it so across the board that it's a difficult thing. Whether your thing did well or didn't well, I think didn't do well. I think the sophomore effort for some reason has that weight to it. It's like, can you do it again? Just the simple fact of, can you do it again? Because writing a book or making an album, I think the origin is, I think with music, to do it again is hard, and you feel like you're supposed to have gotten better at it, and you didn't. And there's a lot of new voices in the room. There's new doubts, and so that, with the global pandemic for 2 years, that was super disruptive to a lot of people's lives, including my own. I think made it harder to get through. Writing this historical piece, I never wanted to write historical fiction. There was this whole like new voice and this load of research that I immersed myself in, that was all new forms of writing for me. I'd never written anything historical before. So there was a lot of new challenges, and I very much didn't want to write the same book. And so I probably wrote 3 books to get to the one. I think that's pretty normal for books. And so in that, there's a lot of having to figure out, and in this case more so than the first one, working with my editor to figure out like what needed to stay, what could go, and to clarifying with myself, what do I absolutely need to say in this book, and what can go for the sake of readability and for the project as a whole. Because with I worked with an editor for sure, but I lived with it for most of the time without an editor. This time, I was sending back and forth with my editor along the way, so it was much more of a collaboration conversation than the first book.
Did you find it? Is it clear to you what you were trying to say that is different from the first book? I mean, I see different things, but I want to just kind of ask you. You said you're kind of struggling to figure out what do you really need to say in this book. What do you need to really get across to the reader? I'm just wondering, do you feel like you're sort of, hey, I'm going to expand and dig deeper on the work that I began in my first book, or was it I want to do something specifically different?
I think it's both. I think this sequel prequel form felt new. I think I deepened a lot of the reflection and meditation into the things that I'm talking about in the first book, that because of the propulsiveness were sort of like they were shown but maybe skipped over, or I didn't dig in and I didn't deepen very many things. I was like, look at all this stuff on the way to this crazy thing about to happen. Wow, that was crazy. I think the pacing of this is slower and more meditative, and maybe even more cerebral because it is slowed down. And I think so stylistically, I was doing stuff differently, and I deepened things that have to do with historical trauma, with familial love, addiction. I touched on all these things in there. But so I think that if anything, this was sort of a deepening to a lot of things that I just touched on in the first book.
Yeah, I agree. The deepening, I felt that deepening, and I appreciated it a lot. So folks, I do see some questions from the audience. We're going to get to those in a minute. And I also just want to acknowledge that Tommy is being like a super mensch here because he's clearly feeling under the weather, but he made time for us. So Tommy, thank you for hanging out. And we're not going to push this too much over the time limit. But thank you for sticking around with us here. Tommy, I want to talk about kind of your identity as a writer. And I've heard you discuss this, and I've heard many other authors discuss this, particularly Black writers, that there is a way that when you put out a book, it is assumed that it is going to be political. It is received as political, regardless of whether you intended it to be that way or not. And any Native American writer and any Black writer is expected to have their book have a position on race, generally speaking. So first of all, I'm just wondering, Do you feel that? Does it affect you at all? And B, this is the change in the landscape a little bit. Do you think soon white writers will be expected to have a point of view on whiteness in their books?
I think it's probably already the case. I'll answer the first part first. I mean, the second part first. Um, I think it's already the case that you can't just write a book as a white writer and not include that piece. I
Mm,
think you sound pretty out of touch if you do. And maybe this doesn't include like um, crime fiction or certain genre fiction. Um, but I think if you're not doing it in literary fiction that's like talking about our times, that's contemporary, um, because I think historical fiction I would just like for now just place in genre fiction, um, in the context of this conversation. I think you have to bring it up. I think the idea that you can be apolitical is a false one. I think it's a privileged based position that has been allowed to go on for way too long. Just like the idea of default writer as white male went on way
mm,
too long. It's all in the same category. Um, as a Native person, I've said before, and a lot of Native people have said, you're born in as a political person into a political context, but everyone is. It's just a matter of like, is that a convenient one for you, or do you have to push up against it because it's actually super harmful for you as a people, your people? So
mm.
I think it just belongs in that same category as like, do you want to be political because you have to, because that's the position you're born into, or you know, as a white writer, like writing a book it takes place in 2024 and no issues of race come up and the main character goes just by a first name the whole time. This sounds absurd. Honestly, it would almost be satire to do it. It would almost be like,
Wow.
oh, are you doing a thing right now? Because I
Mm.
hope you're doing a thing because it's crazy that you're not bringing up any of those contexts.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for that answer. It's kind of the first time I've heard somebody say it quite that way, and I think you're totally right. I think you're totally right. One more question for me, and then we'll take a few audience questions. You end the book, which is just so haunting and elegiac throughout, and then you end the book with some notes of real beauty, and I mean, just to kind of to say it's hopeful or optimism might be a stretch, but there's just some beautiful, beautiful kind of forward-looking sentiment I found at the close of the book. And it's going to, one is an epigraph that you have on part 3 of the book, which is a quote from another author, which says, "Inside myself, I must create someone who will understand." And I thought that was so poetic and sort of just an interesting and beautiful summary of what you're up to in a lot of ways. It's like creating a new self that will understand the self. And then there was another line that was great. How do you live like you have a second chance rather than live like something's been taken from you? And so between those two things, living like you have a second chance and also forging a new self that understands yourself, and that being the work, I thought those were like two quite profound forward-looking sentiments. And I just wanted to bring it back to you to comment on those.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wrote the third part of the book intentionally with hope. You have a character that I don't know if it's a spoiler to talk about certain aspects of it. Should I not?
Up to you. Up to
Doesn't
you.
matter.
Up to you.
I mean, you have a character that's going through recovery and trying to find ways for that to feel like a real thing. Um, so I tried to build like this organic, you know, language and relationship to the ways that he can think of that feel good to him. Um, there's a part where he talks about like building a temple inside him, and he's sort of meditating on visions of the Mormon temple, which is kind of absurd. But it is like a, a landmark visual thing in Oakland because you see it like sort of tucked away in the hills and it looks sort of magical. And he strictly just likes it as a building, like nothing to do with Mormonism. Um, So he's slowly building from the ground up this thing that he needs himself to be. And I think, and then the last part of the book is this other character who is writing about the disappointment in the family and the heartbreak that he felt, but also like wanting to come back from it. And I think when I finished writing there, it was the end of 2016. Trump was getting into office. Standing Rock had just happened. It was super bleak, and it felt like dishonest to write something that like wrapped itself up nicely, and there does the opposite of wrapping itself up nicely. It like ends in chaos. Um, and I think this time around, I needed to write something hopeful, and I wanted to resolve both books because I don't think I'm writing a third one. Um, and so I really wanted to have there to feel like a resolve, not like an unrealistic bow at the end, but like at least if you would feel a sense of resolve.
Indeed. I mean, that was going to be my follow-up question, and I think that's exactly what you did, and you landed it. And in many ways, this is going to sound like a weird comp, maybe, but I was thinking of like The Godfather, the first two films, right? I mean, the first film was a very kind of linear, clear arc and arc of causality, and then the second film kind of goes into the past and then also continues into the future. And I mean, the analogy falls apart a little bit, but there's a depth and an exploration and a widening of the world in the second one. And I really think it just kind of, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Godfather 3, but I think it lands, the end of Godfather 2 kind of lands it for both films, just like this work.
And who knows, maybe I will write my Godfather 3 and it won't be everybody's favorite. When the well dries up, I'll have to go back to old work and trudge stuff up.
Oh yeah, it would just be Kate and Michael in Italy dancing around. All right, let's take some audience questions here. Here we go. This is a great question. Books, Gers, and Purrs, thank you for this question. Tommy Orange, in the Vanity Fair article, you mentioned calling for a blanket dance. Could you expand on how Wandering Stars is in conversation with Oscar Hokia's book? Thank you.
Yeah, so I had a lot of different drafts, a lot of different versions of Wandering Stars, and structurally, I was doing this back and forth in time thing, wanting the past and present to speak to each other structurally in the book. So as a reader, you're going back and forth in a more like maybe jarring, and this is why my editor was first suggested not doing it. But I did have the book going back and forth in time. And when I was making the decision of how to structure the book, ultimately, I read Oscar's book. And so his book starts in the past and is connected by this character named Evers. That's the through line. In every chapter, there's some relation to this character named Evers, but it also goes through these generations of a family. And I could feel by the end of it this building thing. And a lot of books have done this, but for whatever reason, and this was the first time I think, Louise Erdrich has done it in books too, even across different books. But for whatever reason, reading Oscar's book while I was making this decision deeply influenced me to just go for it on this generational structure piece, because I felt it so much when reading his book. It was a new book. I'm constantly reading, what's new out, and a contemporary native novel. It just spoke to me on so many different levels. And so it's sort of often what I read for is to get permission to do something. And I felt like reading his book gave me permission to do this thing that I was wondering whether I would do.
Great. Thank you. Let's do one more from the audience. This is an interesting question from Margaret Pinard. What's your approach to people who feel wronged by recent progressive changes as someone whose historical wronging is still often ignored and discounted?
And that's a tough one. My approach to people, that's the part that's catching me. Like, I don't know what to do with these people. I think that people have every right to be upset about the current wrongdoings as they do about the past ones. It can be frustrating for people not to see that the wrongdoings being done now reflect the wrongdoings done, especially by this country. You know, what's happening with, and I don't want to like create some big division by bringing up Israel Palestine, because I know how much this is a divisive subject. But I can't help but see a lot of coding around Hamas and like the way people must have been talking about Indian raids and like the justification for genocide back then was like, well, we are in fear of Indian raids. Like they're just wild. They'll just come in and take stuff or burn down our villages or like whatever. They'll kill us. We're afraid of these wild Indian savages. This was a real fear at that time and justification for wiping out a lot of us. In a lot of situations, massacres were followed by this hysteria. So I think sometimes, you know, seeing these things happen in real time, and especially the scale, it can be really disheartening, and especially to have the US be so behind this thing happening over there. But I don't want to go too far down that path because I don't want to be divisive. I have my own opinions on that subject. That was not the question the person asked. So.
But it is a very,
I also don't want to leave on that note. You can ask another question. You don't need to rush me off because it sounds like I'm coughing a lot over here. I'm doing a lot.
Not at all. No, it's an extremely powerful historical analogy, and I do appreciate it. So, Tommy, I want to ask you one last question. It's a question that I ask to everybody who comes on the show, and we'll end here. If you could imagine the ideal reader for Wandering Stars, somebody who is just receiving the book in the exact way that you hoped and wished and prayed that it would be received, just tell me in a phrase or even a word, when they finish that book, how do you hope that reader feels?
Like they want to go right. So,
yes, sir.
So I think the best books for me are the ones that make me feel like I immediately want to go right and work on my own thing. Not in a way that like I want to write something like this. Like, no, I know exactly what I want to write and it's my own thing. But because I just read this, I have the energy to like and belief that I'm going to go write it right now. That for me like is the best feeling when I read something that I love and I'm like, okay, I need to go write right now.
Are you writing right now, by the way? Like, are you working on what's next?
I'm working on third book. I sold it at the end of last year. It's not related. It's not Godfather Part 3. It's its own thing. I just finished a screenplay for a feature film. And I want to try to finish the third book a lot faster than the first two, because I don't want to spend another 6 years on a book.
Well, Tommy, it touched me deeply. I mean, there's passages in this book that are some of the most haunting passages that I've read. I just so appreciate you and, you know, the place that you occupy in the literary community. And I just really appreciate you most of all coming on the show when you were like clearly almost on death's doorstep here. This is like really great. And your answers were amazing.
It should be said,
we had go ahead.
It should be said that I have COVID. I'm over the worst of it, but I'm not just like your run-of-the-mill sick. I have COVID. I don't think we said that on air.
I didn't want to bring it up, but yeah, I mean, even with COVID. Yeah. All right, well, Tommy, thank you so much, folks. The book is Wandering Stars by the great Tommy Orange. It sounds like we're going to get another Tommy Orange book, maybe sooner than we had to wait for this one. Tommy, all the praise, all the thanks. We had a huge audience today, one of the larger audiences we've ever had on Thoughtful Bro. So clearly you're striking a chord here and people want to hear from you. So thanks to everybody who showed up.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Take care. See you next time, folks.
You too.